Hello you guys, dungeons in Last Epoch can not only be extremely difficult once you get to the tier 4 dungeons, but they give you some of the best individual rewards in the entire game. Stick around for the whole thing and you'll learn every single boss fight and every single thing you need to know about dungeons in Last Epoch. Well, the first one we're going to go over is the Temporal Sanctum dungeon. In order to access this dungeon, it will be available through the Divine Era and the Ruined Era both. You can reach the Temporal Sanctum dungeon through any points going throughout the campaign. All you'll need is a Temporal Sanctum key, which you can obtain throughout doing monoliths. The Temporal Sanctum dungeon is known for the Eternity Cache. Now, once I get into all the dungeons, it is good to note you can perfectly run through these as much as you'd like, but ideally, if you're looking for better overall gear and not just specific uniques, then it would be best to actually kill a bunch of the enemies in the dungeons themselves, because especially at higher tiers and higher levels, they're going to drop many more and much more rare exalted items. If you just speed through these dungeons, you're going to miss out on a bunch of gear that could actually help your build. The mechanic of this dungeon works to essentially switch you back and forth between realms. The way this works is you're going to swap back and forth in order to navigate to the doors to continue on to the next level. Now, using this mechanic can actually save you if you get overwhelmed by enemies for the most part, but once you reach the final boss, these are the main mechanics you need to pay attention to. Her first mechanic is Catastrophic Implosion. That's essentially as soon as you walk into the area to begin fighting her, she will open up this big portal that will collapse on itself, doing a massive amount of void damage that can easily one-shot you early. But before that actual void collapses, you need to press D in order to switch to the other realm and wait for her to come into the new realm. Now, once she does this, she will actually cast an AoE circle on you. As you can see here, ideally you want to run around the bottom of the screen, wait for her to cast it, and stack these pools up. So that way later in the fight, if you still haven't finished her, all these pools will be stacked down there in an area where you're not going to run into them. Next, she will spawn 3 pillars. These pillars are going to act with lightning bolts to deal a decent amount of shock damage to you and can essentially one-shot you if all 3 are up. So when she casts these, make sure to take them out very quickly. If you don't take them out really quickly, they're going to do a lot of damage to you. She can then also summon a healing fountain. This will heal her pretty consistently, so make sure if you see that as well to get rid of that. Now, one of the main mechanics you need to pay attention to is the conal attack that she does, which is going to hit you for a ton of cold damage and can again one-shot you in this boss fight. Ideally, it would be best to save all of your movement skills, especially your quick ones, for when she does this attack. Next, she has a signature attack that does a ton of void damage. This is going to be where 4 beams are shooting outwards, and there will be an open circle in the middle. The main thing you want to focus on here is staying in that ring where there are obviously no lasers dealing damage to you, and you want to try and run in a circle the entire time, so that way you can avoid any other mechanics that she throws in. And then finally, Jorah does a mortar-like attack that explodes on the ground and can do a lot of lightning damage in a big area. Again, if you do not have a ton of ward, this can one-shot you, so keep an eye out for this being on the ground, because if you don't notice it and you're standing in it, odds are, again, you can get one-shot with this mechanic. And once you've completed this dungeon, you can then use the Eternity Cache to turn your uniques into legendaries. As I mentioned earlier, a big thing to note here is make sure if you do not see any spots to actually put your uniques and exalted items into the Eternity Cache, you then switch realms and it will give you the spots open, and then you can switch realms back and your actual legendary item will be there for you to claim. Next is the Lightless Arbor dungeon. This is the Mountain Beneath boss dungeon, which is where you can go at the very end and unlock a vault with a bunch of different unique pieces, all kinds of crazy gear in it. This is worth doing, especially if you're trying to get the uniques from the boss set himself. The mechanic here is using D to launch your fire orb in different areas. Specifically when it comes to the boss fight and parts of the actual map, you can use this to burn pathways open, so that way you can continue on through them. And then once you get to the actual boss fight itself, there will actually be 2 bosses in this fight that you need to be aware of. The first one's a little bit easier, the second one is a little bit harder. And again, this area has the door system for modifiers into the new areas. The way this boss fight works is there are 2 pillars on each side of this boss. Both have rooted areas that you need to destroy, and then once you do that, you can throw your flame into each of the 2 things on the left and on the right. As you throw it into the left one or the right one, it will begin to burn, and as it burns, it will encase that area in flames. Once it does that, you'll throw it over to the next area, and it will do the exact same thing. Once you have both of them in flames, you just continue to let the second one work, and this will ultimately defeat the boss. And during the boss fight itself, The idea is you kind of just need to stay alive until all of this stuff finishes happening. Now, there are a couple of attacks you need to be aware of, specifically the rock fall. The rock fall is where a large number of rocks are going to fall from the sky and deal a decent amount of damage. All you have to do basically is dodge those. There will also be rocks that fall with summons, so rocks will fall and it will spawn an enemy. Obviously, you just need to take care of that enemy. That's one of the other smaller mechanics. The big one is Shockwave. This is one that's going to one-shot you more than likely if you do not avoid it. It's where he comes down and slams his fist on the ground. If you're caught in that and don't have a lot of ward or shield, he will one-shot you almost all of the time. You need to make sure that you dodge that mechanic. Next is Entangling Roots. When this hits you, it's going to essentially stun you and lock you in place for a certain amount of time, meaning you need to tank a bunch of damage, so make sure to try and avoid this as best as you can. And that's what you need to know for this fight. This fight isn't that difficult, but once you complete this fight, you will go on to the Stone Titan's Heart. You will need to defeat the heart in order to complete the dungeon. The first mechanic you'll need to pay attention to is rocks falling from the sky. These deal a decent amount of physical damage on impact. Essentially, all you need to do is run around and dodge these as best you can. Next is the Summon Titan Flash mechanic, where it's just going to spawn a group of enemies for, again, you to take out, sort of like the first fight. The next is the Spore Beam. This is where the Titan's Heart will shoot out a beam straight in front and split in two directions going all the way around. You just need to be on the opposite side directly of the cast, and this beam will not hit you. Next is Energy Stone, where a large stone circles the Titan's Heart. It will start close and travel to the outward area of the map. Try your best to dodge this, but this deals low physical damage, so it's not super important to worry about. Next is the Energy Wave attack. This is where one quadrant of the map will be taken up by an energy wave. This will apply 4 stacks of poison, but this one is very easy to dodge. Next is the Entangling Roots mechanic, where a big green circle area will appear outside of the heart. This essentially works from the outside in to deal damage. All you need to do to dodge this attack is be very close to the heart, because that inner ring is a safe place that won't actually deal any damage to you. And if you do get caught up in this mechanic, it can immobilize or stun you enough to one-shot you by other mechanics. And then once you get to the end of this dungeon, you'll have access to going into the vault. Again, there are going to be multiple options presented to you that you can accept. And by accepting them, you're going to spend gold to essentially get whatever specific thing that option says, generally regarding exalted items, unique items, shards, and essentially you're paying for decent drops out of these chests that live within the vault. The more items you accept, the bigger loot explosion you're going to see once you go into the vault and claim them all. But as you decline an option, other options get more and more expensive. Next, we're going to move on to the Soulfire Bastion dungeon. This is going to feature the Fire Lich Cremoris boss, and I could argue this is one of the ones with mechanics that are not very straightforward and told to you, but have a decent amount of mechanics in this boss fight that can one-shot you or kill you very easily. Now, once you've obtained a Soulfire Bastion key, you can right-click on it immediately and access this dungeon. Now, this dungeon specifically drops a ton of decent, great loot drops from the boss fight itself, but also contains the Soul Gambler at the end of the dungeon. The way the Soul Gambler works is there's a currency similar to the other instances called souls. What this does is when you press a D going through the maps, this will actually change your resistance from a fire resistance to a necrotic resistance, and different enemies within the dungeon and the boss himself deal fire and necrotic damage at very high levels, so you'll need to make sure you're switching between them enough that you can tank the damages when you need to. For instance, the fire on the ground here, you need to have the fire one on. If you don't have the fire one on and you walk across it, you will die pretty instantly. And it costs 1 soul every time you switch back and forth from these different resistances. And by killing enemies throughout the dungeon, you will get these souls very, very quickly. That means that as you go throughout this map, it is a pseudo random generated map, and it does again have the same doors as the other ones that you can pick different doors and gain different affixes from. Now, once you make your way throughout these dungeons and go down 2 levels, you're going to finally fight the Cremoris boss. Now, this boss is extremely difficult because he uses a bunch of different mechanics that you have to pay attention to at the exact same time. The first big mechanic this boss uses is the Fire and Necrotic floor. The way this works is when you first enter the boss, the floor will be essentially blank, but as you continue to fight him, different areas of the floor will light up in fire or necrotic. What that means is if you are going to stand on a part of that floor, if it's necrotic, you need to have necrotic resistance matched. If it's fire, you need to switch your resistance to fire. Otherwise, this mechanic will kill you very quickly if you don't have the right resistance on while you're standing on that part of the floor. In earlier tier boss fights, this isn't explained really at all, so it's important to keep an eye on this. While you're also focusing on that, he also has 2 types of skulls that orbit him, which will deal necrotic and fire damage that you need to dodge. Another one is a large skull that's cast by him that deals a low amount of damage, but we do want to make sure we're dodging that because it can take off a decent amount of your health. Additionally, he has an attack that can fire and channel a certain amount of fire damage coming straight at you. This attack is easy to dodge, and if you can get behind him, you can do a lot of damage to him during this actual phase. He also spawns a wall of fire that travels across the arena that will hit you and deal a moderate amount of fire damage. Now, if you have necrotic resistance activated, you can do 2 things. You can switch to fire resistance very quickly when it hits you to kind of mitigate some of the damage it will deal, or you can use a teleport skill or a movement skill to move past it if you're able to teleport over that actual line. Remorse actually then will cast a bunch of different skulls at you in direct succession, and one of the big things here is you have to dodge these. These can actually hit you for a lot of different damages as soon as he casts them, and he does cast them for them to follow you around, so you need to make sure you do dodge them because they also apply marked for death on your character, meaning you can overall take a lot more damage this way. Now, Remorse will also use a necrotic circle attack where it collapses from the outside in. You need to make sure you're switching to your necrotic resistance very quickly right before it hits you so you don't take any big damage from this attack. So once you get to the Soul Gambler at the end, he has a list of loot depending on the tier level that you're running that can have sealed affixes on them, higher levels of unique gear, very rare gear that you can gamble for at the end of each one of these dungeons, which makes the dungeon very worthwhile to do. And then again, once you complete that, you will get the boss rewards to gamble for high level uniques and even uniques with sealed affixes on them and other cool items that you can get every time you run this dungeon. That's the way to maximize every dungeon in Last Epoch, get the best rewards from them and all the mechanics you need to beat these bosses, because even on tier 4 they are fairly difficult. That being said, if you guys enjoyed, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you're new. Only like 2% of you guys are subscribed, and also check out either of these last 2 Epoch videos on the left or right.